Marcus Chen pulled over on the rain-soaked highway that cold November evening, never knowing that the injured woman lying beside her overturned luxury sedan would transform his family's destiny forever. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Chen's alarm buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, the same relentless sound that had pulled him from sleep every day for the past 3 years. He rolled out of the narrow bed in his cramped bedroom, his joints protesting the long hours and physical demands of his 2 jobs. The apartment was quiet except for the familiar sounds of the old building settling around them, pipes creaking and the upstairs neighbor's television murmuring through thin walls. He padded softly across the worn linoleum floor, careful not to wake his daughters who shared the single bedroom while he slept on the couch most nights. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily into a coffee mug he'd placed beneath it to catch the water, a temporary solution that had become permanent like so many things in their small world. Marcus filled the kettle with the precious hot water and set it on the stove, the blue flame flickering to life as he prepared for another day that would stretch from his early morning shift at the warehouse until his evening hours cleaning office buildings downtown. The refrigerator hummed loudly, its door held shut with a piece of duct tape, while inside the sparse contents spoke of careful budgeting and strategic meal planning. A half-empty carton of milk, some leftover rice from last night's dinner, and a few eggs that would become breakfast for Emma and Sophie before school. He moved through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to make every moment count, every dollar stretch, every sacrifice worthwhile for the 2 sleeping angels who had become his entire universe since their mother left when Emma was barely 5 years old. The morning light filtered through curtains that had seen better days, casting a warm glow over their humble home that was rich in love, despite its material poverty, where laughter echoed more often than complaints, and where dignity lived in every corner despite the peeling paint and secondhand furniture. The rain hammered against Marcus's windshield as he drove home from his second job that November evening, his ancient pickup truck struggling against the wind that seemed determined to push him off the dark highway. He was exhausted, bone-deep tired in the way that comes from working 16-hour days, but his mind was already focused on getting home to check on Emma and Sophie, who were old enough now to stay alone for a few hours but still young enough to worry about in storms like this. The headlights of his truck barely penetrated the sheets of rain, and he was driving slowly, carefully, when he saw the twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the asphalt ahead. His heart lurched as he recognized the scene immediately, the overturned luxury sedan resting against the guardrail like a wounded animal, steam rising from its crumpled hood while rain pounded its exposed undercarriage. Marcus pulled over without hesitation, his truck coughing and sputtering as he parked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly against the storm. He grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment, the one with the dying batteries that he'd been meaning to replace for months, and stepped out into the driving rain that soaked through his worn jacket within seconds. The woman was lying motionless beside the wreckage, her designer dress torn and muddy, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead as rain washed it away almost as quickly as it appeared. She was breathing but unconscious, her expensive jewelry glinting in his flashlight beam, while her perfectly styled hair was now matted with rain and dirt. Marcus knelt beside her without thinking about his clean work shirt or his one good pair of pants, his calloused hands gentle as he checked for broken bones, his voice soft and reassuring as he spoke to her even though she couldn't hear him, telling her she was going to be okay, that help was coming, that she wasn't alone in this storm. Marcus's fingers trembled as he dialed 911 on his cracked phone screen, rain making it difficult to see the numbers while he kept one hand pressed gently against the woman's shoulder to steady her as she began to stir. "There's been a car accident on Highway 12 near mile marker 47, he said into the phone, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Single vehicle rollover, one injured woman. She's conscious but bleeding from a head wound." The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and frightened, and she tried to sit up before Marcus's gentle touch guided her back down. "Easy now, don't move too much," he said softly, his voice carrying the same tender tone he used with his daughters when they had nightmares. "You've been in an accident, but you're going to be okay. Help is on the way." She looked up at him through the rain, confusion clouding her features as she took in his weathered face and kind eyes. This stranger who smelled of honest work and spoke with such genuine concern. Her silk blouse, what remained of it, probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and the twisted wreckage of her car represented more money than he'd ever seen in one place. But none of that mattered as he shrugged out of his jacket and placed it over her shoulders to shield her from the worst of the rain. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Noting the expensive watch on her wrist and the designer handbag that had spilled its contents across the wet asphalt, credit cards and business cards scattered like confetti in the storm. "Victoria," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain and wind. "Victoria Sterling," and something in the way she said her name suggested she was used to that name, meaning something, carrying weight in boardrooms and society pages. But here on this dark highway, she was simply a hurt woman who needed help. And Marcus gave it without question or expectation, his blue-collar hands more gentle than any doctor's as he kept talking to her, keeping her alert and calm until the ambulance sirens finally cut through the storm. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room made Marcus squint as he followed the paramedics through the automatic doors, his wet clothes dripping onto the polished linoleum floors, while concerned nurses rushed past with clipboards and medical equipment. He had told himself he would just make sure she arrived safely, that his responsibility ended once the professionals took over. But something about Victoria Sterling's frightened eyes in those final moments before the ambulance doors closed had compelled him to follow in his sputtering truck. The attending physician, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, emerged from behind the curtained area where they had taken Victoria and approached Marcus with a questioning look. "Are you family?" she asked, and Marcus shook his head, explaining quietly that he was just the person who found her, that he wanted to make sure she was going to be okay before he headed home to his daughters. Through the partially open curtain, he could hear Victoria's voice, weak and confused, calling out a name he didn't recognize. "David?" she kept saying. "David, is that you?" The nurse gently corrected her each time, but Victoria's head injury had left her disoriented, mixing past and present in ways that made Marcus's heart ache with recognition of profound loss. When the doctor finally allowed him to see her, Victoria's eyes focused on his face with startling intensity, and for a moment she seemed to see him clearly. "You saved me," she whispered, her hand reaching out to touch his arm with surprising strength, her fingers still adorned with rings that probably cost more than his yearly rent. Yet her gratitude was utterly genuine, unfiltered by the usual calculations of wealth and social position. "Thank you," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't even know your name, but you stayed with me when you could have just driven past." Marcus felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny, aware suddenly of his damp work clothes and calloused hands in this pristine medical environment where everything was clean and expensive and efficient. "Anyone would have done the same," he said quietly, but Victoria shook her head weakly, a sad smile crossing her bruised features as if she knew something about the world that he didn't, something that made his simple act of kindness seem more rare and precious than he could possibly understand. Marcus climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, each step heavier than the last as exhaustion from the long day and the emotional weight of the accident settled into his bones. The hallway smelled of cooking spices and old carpet, familiar scents that usually welcomed him home, but tonight he noticed the darkness seeping from beneath their door, and his heart sank with the realization that the electric company had finally followed through on their threat. He fumbled for his keys in the dim light, hearing voices from inside, and when he opened the door he found Emma and Sophie huddled together at the small kitchen table, their homework spread out before them in the flickering glow of 3 emergency candles he kept for situations exactly like this. "Daddy!" Emma cried, jumping up to wrap her arms around his damp legs while Sophie looked up from her math worksheet with eyes that held too much understanding for a 12-year-old. The kind of premature wisdom that comes from living with uncertainty and learning not to complain about things beyond anyone's control. "The lights went out right after dinner," Sophie explained matter-of-factly, "but we remembered where you keep the matches, and we've been working by candlelight just like Laura Ingalls Wilder." Emma nodded enthusiastically, apparently viewing their situation as an adventure rather than another sign of their financial struggles, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and guilt that his youngest daughter could find joy in their hardships while he lay awake at night calculating bills and wondering how much longer he could keep their small world together. He helped them finish their homework by candlelight, listening to Emma read aloud from her library book while Sophie worked through algebra problems with the focused determination she'd inherited from him, neither girl asking when the lights would come back on or mentioning the incident that had delayed his return home. The candles cast dancing shadows on the walls of their small apartment, transforming their cramped space into something almost magical. And as Marcus tucked his daughters into bed, he chose not to tell them about the accident, about the woman named Victoria Sterling, about how strange it had felt to glimpse a world so different from their own, because this moment felt complete enough without adding complications they didn't need to carry. Victoria Sterling woke in the pristine silence of her private hospital room. Sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a view that probably cost more per night than most people made in a month. Yet she found herself thinking not of her luxurious surroundings, but of calloused hands and a gentle voice speaking to her through the rain. The events of the previous evening came back in fragments, pieces of memory that felt both vivid and dreamlike. The smell of honest work on wet clothes, the way that stranger had knelt beside her in the mud without hesitation, his voice steady and reassuring when her world had literally turned upside down. Her head throbbed where the stitches pulled at her scalp, and her ribs ached with every breath. But what struck her most profoundly was the memory of how safe she had felt in those terrifying moments, protected by someone who had no idea who she was or what she was worth. Marcus Chen, her personal assistant for the past 8 years, appeared in the doorway with her usual efficient smile, arms full of flowers and get-well cards from business associates and board members, people who expressed concern in carefully crafted corporate language that felt hollow compared to the simple humanity she'd experienced on that dark highway. "The police need a statement when you're feeling up to it," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside Victoria's bed with her ever-present tablet and perfectly organized schedule. "And the insurance company has already sent an adjuster to examine the car, though I'm afraid it's a total loss." Victoria nodded absently, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since she'd regained full consciousness. "The man who helped me, the one who called the ambulance, did anyone get his contact information?" Margaret consulted her tablet with the thoroughness that made her indispensable in Victoria's complex business world, but her expression grew puzzled as she scrolled through her notes. "That's odd," she said slowly. "The paramedics said someone had called it in and stayed with you until they arrived, but there's no record of his name or contact information anywhere in the reports, and the hospital staff assumed he was family since he followed the ambulance, but when they asked directly, he just said he was glad you were okay and disappeared into the night." Victoria Sterling had built her fortune by being thorough and relentless in pursuit of her goals, qualities that now drove her to find the man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return, a mystery that consumed her thoughts even as she recovered from her injuries. She mobilized her resources with the same intensity she brought to corporate acquisitions, hiring the private investigation firm that had served her company for years to track down the Good Samaritan who had vanished without leaving so much as a first name. The investigators worked with professional efficiency, pulling traffic camera footage from the highway, cross-referencing the timestamp of the 911 call with cell tower data, and interviewing the paramedics who remembered a quiet man in work clothes who had followed them to the hospital in an old pickup truck. Within 72 hours, they had identified Marcus Chen, age 34, single father of 2 daughters, employed at Morrison Warehouse during the day and cleaning offices for Bright Star Janitorial Services in the evenings, living in a modest apartment complex on the south side of town where the rent was affordable and the dreams were often deferred but never abandoned. The investigators' report painted a picture of a man whose life was defined by sacrifice and quiet dignity. Someone who worked 2 jobs to support his family after his ex-wife had abandoned them, who had never missed a parent-teacher conference despite his exhausting schedule, who was respected by his co-workers and beloved by his daughters, who knew nothing of luxury but everything about love. Victoria studied the surveillance photos with fascination, seeing Marcus in his natural environment, loading trucks at the warehouse with methodical strength, picking up his daughters from school in his battered pickup truck, grocery shopping with a list and coupons, like someone who had to make every dollar count. The contrast between her world and his was stark and humbling, yet what moved her most was learning that he had volunteered at the local food bank every Thanksgiving for the past 5 years, giving his time to help others even when he had so little himself. embodying a generosity of spirit that had nothing to do with bank balances or stock portfolios, and everything to do with the size of a person's heart. Marcus heard the soft knock on his apartment door just as he was helping Emma with her spelling homework at the kitchen table, the sound so different from the usual heavy-handed banging of neighbors or bill collectors that he paused mid-sentence, wondering who could be visiting on a Thursday evening when most people were settling into their routines. He opened the door to find Victoria Sterling standing in the narrow hallway, transformed from the injured woman he'd rescued into someone who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her designer coat perfectly tailored, her hair styled in soft waves that framed a face made beautiful, not just by expensive makeup, but by the genuine warmth in her eyes. As she smiled at his obvious surprise, she held a bouquet of flowers that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget, white lilies and roses arranged with professional elegance, yet she held them with the nervous uncertainty of someone who rarely made personal gestures without the buffer of assistance and social protocols. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said softly, her voice carrying the cultured tones of private schools and boardrooms, "but I had to find you, to thank you properly for what you did." Behind Marcus, Emma's curious voice piped up from the kitchen table, where she and Sophie had abandoned their homework to stare wide-eyed at the elegant stranger, who seemed to glow with an otherworldly sophistication that made their humble apartment feel even smaller and shabbier by comparison. "Daddy, who is that beautiful lady?" Emma whispered loudly enough for Victoria to hear, causing a genuine laugh to escape Victoria's perfectly lipsticked mouth, a sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it delighted the girls. Sophie, ever the protective older sister, moved to stand beside her father, with the cautious dignity she'd inherited from him, but her eyes were bright with curiosity as she took in Victoria's expensive clothes and confident bearing, recognizing instinctively that this woman belonged to a world far different from their own. "Girls," Marcus said quietly, his voice gentle but firm as he tried to process this unexpected development. "This is Miss Sterling, the lady I helped the other night. And Miss Sterling, these are my daughters Emma and Sophie." The introductions feeling surreal as two completely different worlds collided in the doorway of his modest home. Victoria reached into her elegant leather purse with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to solving problems with money, withdrawing an envelope that she extended toward Marcus with a smile that faltered slightly when she saw his expression change from welcome to something harder to read. "Please," she said softly, "I know this can't truly repay what you did for me, but I wanted to do something meaningful for your family, something that might make your lives a little easier." Marcus looked down at the envelope without taking it, his calloused hands remaining at his sides while Emma and Sophie watched from the kitchen table with wide eyes, sensing the sudden tension in the room even if they didn't understand its source. "That's very kind of you, Miss Sterling," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle firmness he used when teaching his daughters right from wrong. "But I can't accept that. What I did wasn't about getting paid. It was just what anyone should do when someone needs help." Victoria felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as she realized how her gesture must appear to him, how it reduced his act of pure compassion to a transaction that could be settled with a check, diminishing the very thing she had come to celebrate. "I didn't mean to insult you," she said quickly, her polished composure cracking to reveal genuine distress. "I just wanted to express my gratitude in some tangible way, to help your family because you helped me when I was completely helpless." Marcus shook his head with a sad smile that made Victoria's chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion, something that felt like shame mixed with profound respect for a man whose dignity remained intact, despite circumstances that would have broken lesser people. "Miss Sterling," he said gently, "the fact that you came here yourself, that you took the time to find me and thank me personally, that means more than any amount of money ever could, because it tells me that what happened that night mattered to you as a person, not just as someone with a debt to settle." In that moment, Victoria understood with startling clarity that she had spent years surrounded by people who could be bought, influenced, or impressed with her wealth. But here stood a man whose values couldn't be purchased, whose integrity was worth more than all her assets combined. And the realization was both humbling and oddly liberating. What began as an awkward visit gradually transformed into something neither Marcus nor Victoria had expected when she accepted his invitation to stay for dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and homemade sauce that Emma proudly announced she had helped prepare, her small hands having stirred the pot while Sophie chopped vegetables with the careful concentration of someone who had learned kitchen responsibility at an early age. Victoria found herself seated at their small table, her designer clothes incongruous against the mismatched chairs and cheerful plastic placemats, watching with fascination as the family moved through their evening routine with an easy rhythm born of love and necessity. Emma chattered excitedly about her day at school, describing her art project with animated gestures that made Victoria smile despite herself, while Sophie quietly ensured everyone had enough food, playing the role of little mother with a maturity that made Victoria's heart ache for the childhood this girl had sacrificed to help her father keep their small family together. The apartment felt warm despite its modest furnishings, filled with laughter that seemed to echo off the walls and settle into every corner, creating an atmosphere of contentment that Victoria realized she hadn't experienced in her own mansion in years. After dinner, Marcus insisted on washing dishes by hand, since the dishwasher had been broken for months, and Victoria surprised herself by asking to help, rolling up the sleeves of her expensive blouse to dry plates alongside Emma, who giggled at the elegant lady's clumsy attempts at domestic tasks. The evening stretched on with board games played by lamplight, Sophie teaching Victoria to play checkers while Emma curled up against her father's side reading aloud from a library book about adventure and friendship, her voice rising and falling dramatically as she brought the characters to life. Victoria watched Marcus's face as he listened to his daughter read, seeing the pure pride and love that radiated from him like warmth from a fire, and she realized that despite their financial struggles, despite the broken dishwasher and the second-hand furniture, and the careful budgeting that governed every decision, this family possessed something she had lost somewhere in her climb to success, something precious and real that all her wealth couldn't buy back. After Emma and Sophie had been tucked into bed with gentle kisses and whispered goodnights, Victoria found herself alone with Marcus in the small living room. The silence between them comfortable, despite their vastly different worlds, and something about the warmth of his family's love had loosened the careful wall she had built around her heart over the past 5 years. "You have something beautiful here?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the peace that seemed to permeate every corner of the modest apartment. "Something I thought I'd never see again." Marcus settled into the worn armchair across from her, his kind eyes inviting confidence without demanding it. And Victoria felt an unexpected urge to share the story she had kept locked away for so long, the tragedy that had transformed her from a loving wife and mother into the cold, efficient businesswoman the world knew today. "I had a family once," she began, her fingers absently twisting the wedding ring she still wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her designer clothes, like a secret she couldn't bear to reveal, but couldn't bear to abandon. "My husband David was a teacher, the kind of man who believed in making the world better one child at a time, and our daughter Lucy was 8 years old, the same age as Emma, full of questions and laughter and dreams about becoming a veterinarian so she could help all the animals in the world." The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush as 5 years of suppressed grief poured out in the safety of Marcus's quiet presence. The story of a family vacation that had ended in twisted metal and flashing lights, of a drunk driver who had stolen her entire world in a single moment of senseless violence, leaving her wealthy and successful and utterly alone. "After the funeral, I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense anymore," she continued, tears flowing freely now as she spoke to this gentleman who understood loss in his own way. "I built an empire because building something felt like the opposite of having everything destroyed. But I realize now that I built walls instead of bridges, barriers instead of connections, and I've been living in a beautiful prison of my own making, surrounded by people who work for me or want something from me but never just want to be with me." Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself drawn back to the Chen family's apartment, like a flower turning toward sunlight, each visit revealing new layers of warmth and authenticity that she had forgotten could exist in human relationships. She began timing her visits to coincide with homework hour, bringing expensive art supplies for Emma's creative projects and helping Sophie with math problems that reminded Victoria of her own daughter's struggles with algebra. The bittersweet memories now bringing comfort rather than pain, as she watched these girls navigate their challenges with the same determination Lucy had shown. Marcus never asked about her wealth or her business empire. Never treated her differently because of her designer clothes or the expensive car she now drove to their neighborhood, instead welcoming her presence with the same gentle acceptance he showed everyone in his orbit, making her feel valued simply for who she was rather than what she could provide. Emma had taken to hugging Victoria goodbye after each visit, her small arms wrapping around Victoria's waist with uninhibited affection that made Victoria's heart skip beats she had forgotten were possible, while Sophie, more reserved but equally caring, began sharing stories about school and friends with the tentative trust of someone learning to let another adult into her carefully guarded world. The simple rituals of their evenings together became sacred to Victoria. The shared meals where conversation flowed naturally between serious topics and silly jokes, the board games that grew competitive in the most delightful way, the bedtime stories that Marcus read aloud, while both girls and Victoria listened with equal fascination to tales of adventure and friendship. She found herself laughing more in their tiny living room than she had in years of expensive restaurants and exclusive social gatherings, her corporate mask slipping away to reveal the woman she had been before tragedy hardened her heart into something efficient but empty. Marcus noticed the change in her, the way her smiles came easier and her shoulders relaxed when she walked through their door. The way she began asking about their daily lives, not out of polite interest but genuine care, and he realized that healing was happening for all of them, that sometimes broken people found each other not by accident but by design, guided by forces larger than themselves toward the love they needed most. The eviction notice arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, the official legal language stark and unforgiving against the cheerful yellow paper that Marcus had always associated with sunshine and hope until this moment when it became the harbinger of his worst fears made manifest. 3 months behind on rent despite his desperate attempts to catch up, working extra shifts at the warehouse until his supervisor warned him about overtime restrictions, taking on additional cleaning jobs that kept him away from Emma and Sophie until nearly midnight, yet still falling further behind as the cost of living outpaced his ability to earn enough to sustain their modest existence. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, had been patient longer than Marcus had any right to expect, but patience had limits when business was business, and other tenants were waiting for affordable apartments in a city where decent housing grew scarce and expensive with each passing year. Marcus stared at the notice with trembling hands, the words blurring as he calculated and recalculated numbers that refused to add up to salvation, knowing that in 30 days they would be homeless unless he could produce nearly $2,000 that might as well have been $2 million given his current circumstances. That evening, as he helped Emma with her spelling words and listened to Sophie practice her violin, a second-hand instrument with scratched wood and strings that needed replacing, he struggled to maintain his composure while his mind raced through impossible scenarios and desperate measures. The girls sensed his distress despite his efforts to shield them. Emma climbing onto his lap during story time with the intuitive wisdom of children who know when their safe world teeters on the edge of chaos, while Sophie watched him with eyes that held too much understanding, already calculating in her 12-year-old mind how she might help carry burdens that should never fall on such young shoulders. He worked through the night, taking extra cleaning shifts at office buildings downtown, his back aching and his hands raw from industrial chemicals, but the additional money barely made a dent in the mountain of debt that threatened to crush everything he had built for his daughters, every sacrifice and struggle suddenly feeling insufficient against the relentless mathematics of poverty that trapped good people in cycles they couldn't break through determination alone. Victoria noticed the change in Marcus immediately when she arrived for what had become her regular Thursday evening visit, the way his smile seemed forced and his shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there the week before, the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes directly, as if he were hiding something that caused him shame rather than deserved sympathy. Emma was quieter than usual, clinging to her father's side with an anxiety that made Victoria's maternal instincts flare to life, while Sophie moved through their evening routine with a brittle efficiency that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. It was only when Victoria overheard Marcus on a hushed phone call with someone he was begging for an extension, his voice cracking with desperation as he promised money he clearly didn't have, that she began to understand the crisis that had descended on this family she had come to love like her own. After putting the girls to bed, Marcus finally admitted the truth about the eviction notice. his voice hollow with defeat as he explained that despite working himself to exhaustion, he couldn't catch up on the rent, couldn't find a way to keep his daughters from losing the only stable home they had ever known. Victoria's first instinct was to write a check, to solve the problem with the same swift efficiency she brought to business challenges, but she remembered the wounded dignity in Marcus's eyes when she had offered money before, understood that her wealth was both a blessing and a barrier in this moment, when what he needed most was help he could accept without sacrificing his self-respect. She lay awake that night in her empty mansion, surrounded by luxury that felt meaningless compared to the warmth of the Chen family's love, wrestling with the knowledge that she could solve their crisis with an amount of money that represented pocket change to her, but would fundamentally alter the dynamic of their relationship. How could she help without making Marcus feel like charity, without turning their genuine friendship into something transactional and hollow, without destroying the very thing that made their connection so precious by introducing the corrupting influence of her vast wealth into their pure and honest bond? Victoria had spent 3 sleepless nights crafting her approach, pacing the marble floors of her executive office while reviewing and discarding dozens of strategies until she finally understood that honesty wrapped in genuine respect would be the only way to bridge the gap between Marcus's pride and his family's desperate need. She arrived at his apartment on Sunday morning with a manila folder and a nervous energy that reminded her of her first board presentation 20 years ago, finding Marcus exhausted from another night of extra cleaning shifts, dark circles under his kind eyes, as he welcomed her with the same gentle warmth despite his obvious fatigue. "Marcus," she began carefully, settling into the familiar chair at their kitchen table, while Emma played quietly with her coloring books and Sophie practiced violin in the bedroom. "I have a proposition for you. Something that has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the fact that you possess qualities my business desperately needs." She opened the folder to reveal organizational charts and mission statements for the Pristine Sterling Foundation, her charitable organization that had grown unwieldy and impersonal under the management of well-meaning but disconnected executives who understood finance but had never experienced the struggles of the people they were meant to help. "I've been searching for someone to run my foundation, someone who understands dignity and compassion not from textbooks but from lived experience, someone who can connect with people in genuine need because they've walked that path themselves," she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she saw Marcus's attention sharpen with interest rather than the wariness she had feared. The position would pay $60,000 annually, with full health benefits and flexible hours that would allow him to be present for his daughters, responsibilities that would utilize his natural empathy and organizational skills while giving him the resources to build a stable life for his family. "This isn't about rescuing you," Victoria said quietly, meeting his eyes directly so he could see the sincerity there. "This is about me recognizing that the foundation has been missing something essential, something you could bring to help us actually make a difference in people's lives, instead of just moving money around from a distance. And frankly, I'm being selfish because working with someone I trust and respect would make the whole endeavor meaningful again." Marcus sat at his kitchen table that night staring at the job offer, the professional letterhead and generous salary figures seeming almost surreal in the dim light of their modest apartment, while his mind churned through a storm of conflicting emotions that had kept him awake for hours, wrestling with pride and practicality. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, to maintain the independence he had fought so hard to preserve since becoming a single father, because accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that his best efforts weren't enough to protect his daughters from the harsh realities of their circumstances. Yet another part of him recognized the genuine respect in Victoria's offer, the way she had framed it as a business decision rather than charity, emphasizing his qualifications and potential contributions rather than his need, and he found himself cautiously hopeful that perhaps this wasn't the kind of help that would diminish his dignity, but rather an opportunity to use his experiences to help others facing similar struggles. Emma wandered out of the bedroom in her worn pajamas, padding across the cold linoleum to climb onto his lap with the sleepy affection that always melted his heart, her small hand touching the papers as she asked in her innocent way why Daddy looked so worried. "Miss Victoria wants to give me a new job," he explained gently, "but I'm not sure if I should take it because it might change things between us, and I don't want her to think we're only friends because she's helping our family." Sophie appeared in the doorway with the serious expression she wore when thinking through complex problems, her 12-year-old wisdom surprising him as she settled into the chair beside them, and considered his dilemma with mature thoughtfulness. "Daddy," she said finally, her voice carrying a confidence that reminded him startlingly of her mother's practical nature. "Miss Victoria comes here because she likes us, not because she feels sorry for us. And if she thinks you're good at something important, maybe you should believe her instead of letting your pride make decisions for our whole family." Emma nodded sleepily against his chest, adding in her sweet lisp that Miss Victoria was the nicest lady she'd ever met, and that maybe God had sent her to help them just like Daddy had helped her on that rainy night. The simple faith of childhood cutting through his adult complications with startling clarity. Marcus called Victoria the next morning before he could lose his nerve, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed her number, and heard her professional assistant announce that Miss Sterling was in a board meeting. But when Victoria learned who was calling, she took the phone immediately, her voice warm with anticipation as Marcus cleared his throat and said simply, "I'd like to accept your offer, if it's still available." The relief in Victoria's voice was palpable as she assured him the position was his and that she would have contracts prepared immediately. But what touched Marcus most was when she quietly added that she couldn't think of anyone better suited to help people who needed genuine understanding rather than bureaucratic sympathy. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had given notice at both his jobs, enduring the warehouse supervisor's disappointed lecture about throwing away steady employment for what he called fancy ideas above your station, while the janitorial company wished him well with the sort of skeptical optimism reserved for people who might be making a terrible mistake. His first day at the Sterling Foundation offices downtown felt surreal as he rode the elevator to the 20th floor, his one good suit freshly pressed and his worn briefcase looking shabby against the marble and mahogany elegance of corporate success. Yet Victoria's genuine smile when she met him in the lobby made him feel welcome rather than out of place. The foundation's previous director had left behind files full of statistics and budget reports, but Marcus immediately began visiting the actual programs they funded, talking directly with people who ran food banks and homeless shelters, learning that many of their grants went to organizations that had lost touch with the communities they served. His first month's salary allowed him to catch up on rent and buy groceries without counting every penny, to replace Emma's worn shoes and get Sophie's violin properly repaired, small improvements that felt like enormous victories after years of constant financial stress. Yet what mattered most to Marcus was that success hadn't changed the heart of their family life, that they still gathered around the same small kitchen table for dinner, still played board games in the evening, still said bedtime prayers together, while Emma and Sophie thanked God for Daddy's new job and for Miss Victoria, who had become like family to them all. Victoria's presence in their lives evolved so naturally that Marcus couldn't pinpoint exactly when she stopped being a visitor and became an integral part of their family rhythm, her Thursday evening dinners expanding to weekend outings where she delighted in simple pleasures she had forgotten existed, like teaching Emma to braid friendship bracelets or helping Sophie with science projects that reminded her of the curiosity Lucy had shown at that same age. The girls began calling her Aunt Victoria without any prompting, and she treasured the title more than any corporate honor she had ever received, finding herself shopping for their favorite snacks and remembering their school events with the devoted attention she had once reserved for board meetings and quarterly reports. Marcus watched her transformation with growing wonder, seeing glimpses of the woman she must have been before tragedy hardened her heart, the way she laughed at Emma's silly jokes with genuine delight, and listened to Sophie's dreams about becoming a doctor with the same respect she would show any accomplished professional. Their conversations deepened as trust grew between them, quiet talks after the girls were asleep when they shared stories about their past struggles and future hopes, Marcus describing the loneliness of single parenthood while Victoria spoke of the isolation that came with wealth and success without love to give it meaning. The attraction that had been simmering beneath their friendship finally surfaced one evening in December when Victoria arrived with hot chocolate and found Marcus hanging Christmas lights he'd finally been able to afford, their hands brushing as she helped him untangle the strings, both of them freezing at the electric contact that had nothing to do with holiday decorations. "I never thought I could feel this way again," Victoria whispered as Marcus's calloused hands gently cupped her face, his eyes searching hers with the careful tenderness of someone who understood that second chances at love were precious and fragile things that required patience and reverence. Their first kiss happened with Emma and Sophie safely asleep in the next room, soft and tentative and full of promise, tasting of hope and healing, and the possibility that broken hearts could indeed learn to love again, when they found the right person to trust with their carefully guarded vulnerability. Christmas morning at the Chen apartment was transformed into something magical that had nothing to do with the modest tree Victoria had helped them decorate or the carefully chosen gifts she had wrapped with Emma's enthusiastic assistance, but everything to do with the way laughter filled every corner of their small home as the girls tore through wrapping paper with the unbridled joy that made Victoria's heart swell with emotions she hadn't felt in 5 years. She had bought thoughtful presents rather than expensive ones, understanding now that Sophie's delight in a new set of mechanical pencils for her technical drawings meant more than any jewelry ever could, while Emma's squeals over a beginner's paint set represented pure happiness that couldn't be purchased, only shared between people who truly knew and loved each other. Marcus had worried about his own modest gifts for Victoria, a handmade photo frame containing a picture of their little family at the Foundation's Thanksgiving dinner. But when she unwrapped it, her eyes filled with tears that spoke of gratitude deeper than words could express. As they sat together on the couch watching the girls play with their new treasures, Victoria felt a profound sense of completeness wash over her. The realization that she had stumbled into exactly the life she hadn't dared to hope for after losing David and Lucy, not a replacement for what she had lost, but a different kind of love that honored her past while embracing her future. "I used to think God had forgotten about me," she whispered to Marcus as Emma curled up between them with a Christmas story. "But maybe he was just waiting for the right time to bring me home." Marcus understood with startling clarity that the broken woman he had found beside that overturned car had been healed not through therapy or time alone, but through the simple act of loving and being loved in return, through finding purpose in caring for others and allowing herself to be cared for without shame or reservation. The Christmas lights twinkled softly in the afternoon dim, casting warm shadows over their makeshift family, as Victoria realized that she had gained more than she had ever lost, that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared with open hearts, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as chance encounters on dark highways where angels waited to guide broken souls toward the light they needed most. 6 months after that magical Christmas morning, Marcus knelt in the small garden behind their new home, a modest but comfortable house that Victoria had insisted they choose together, rather than her simply providing one. His heart pounding as Emma and Sophie watched from the kitchen window with barely contained excitement, knowing the secret they had helped him plan for weeks. The engagement ring was simple and beautiful, chosen not for its price but for the way it caught the light, like the hope that had transformed all their lives. And when Victoria said yes with tears streaming down her face, the girls burst through the back door to envelop them both in a family hug that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Their wedding 6 months later was held not in some grand cathedral, but in the community center where Marcus had first taken Victoria to see the Foundation's work in action, surrounded by the people whose lives they had touched together. Children from the after-school programs Victoria now funded with personal attention rather than distant checks. Families who had found stability through Marcus's empathetic guidance and Victoria's resources channeled through his understanding heart. The Sterling Foundation had become a model for effective philanthropy under Marcus's leadership, focusing on sustainable solutions rather than temporary fixes, empowering communities rather than creating dependence, and Victoria found more satisfaction in this meaningful work than she had ever found in her previous corporate successes. Emma and Sophie flourished under Victoria's devoted attention, calling her mom with the same natural affection they showed Marcus, while Victoria discovered that being a stepmother allowed her to honor Lucy's memory while embracing new love, understanding finally that hearts don't have limited capacity, but rather expand to accommodate all the love they're offered. As they stood together in their garden one evening, watching the girls chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Victoria marveled at the chain of events that had brought them together. How one man's simple act of kindness on a rainy highway had rippled outward to transform not just her life, but the lives of countless others who benefited from their combined compassion and resources. Marcus wrapped his arms around his wife, seeing in her eyes the reflection of his own wonder at how broken pieces could be reassembled into something more beautiful than what had come before. Proof that love multiplied when freely given, that second chances were possible for those brave enough to trust in kindness, and that sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because their hearts told them it was right.